Okay, so we've got some really interesting Buddhist concepts to explore. You've sent us a collection of texts here, classic texts, a study guide, and they all seem to be kind of circling around some pretty big questions. Life, death, the nature of existence itself. Yeah. And today, we're going to try to unpack some of these, focusing on suffering, this idea of the 25 trap, and this whole cycle of birth, aging, sickness, and death. Now, just from reading through these materials, I get the sense that you're, looking for a deeper understanding of how all of these concepts kind of fit together, and maybe even how they apply to your own life, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's really where it gets interesting, right? Seeing how these ancient teachings might actually resonate with, our modern experiences.
Exactly, exactly. So, this whole 25 trap thing, that definitely kind of jumped out at me. It sounds a bit ominous, doesn't it? Like we're all kind of caught in this cosmic game with rules that we don't fully understand.
Well, the rules are karma, to be precise.
Yeah.
The 25 trap refers to these 25 categories of existence that we're born into based on our past actions.
Yeah.
It's not so much a trap as a reflection of cause and effect, I'd say.
But if our actions determine our rebirth, then what kind of choices can we make today to maybe kind of nudge ourselves towards a more positive future existence?
That's the question, isn't it? And it really gets to the heart of Buddhist practice. The text describes three realms of existence: the desire realm, the color realm, and the colorless realm. Each of them, with different characteristics, different levels of suffering. Most of us reside in this realm of desire, right? Driven by sensual pleasures and attachments. It's said to contain 14 of the 25 existences.
Oh, wow. So does that mean that actions that are driven by desire lead to rebirth in those 14 existences, while actions that are maybe more focused on something else, like mental clarity or wisdom, might lead to a different realm?
That's the idea. The realm of color is much more refined, more associated with meditative states. Less about indulging those desires and more about this kind of mental clarity, this deeper understanding. 7 of the 25 existences reside there. Then you have the colorless realm, which is completely formless. The highest level of meditative absorption, which contains the final 4 existences.
So based on this idea, would striving for enlightenment and engaging in, practices that cultivate wisdom and compassion potentially shift someone towards those higher realms?
Exactly. It's not just about avoiding, negative actions. It's about actively cultivating those positive qualities that lead to a more liberated state of being.
Wow, I'm starting to see how understanding this whole 25 trap concept could really, really change how we approach our daily choices.
That's the power of these teachings. They offer a framework for understanding not just the nature of existence, but also how our actions actually shape our experience, both now and in future lives.
Well, that brings us to another concept that seems pretty central to Buddhist thought, and that's suffering. Now, the text that you shared, they mention 8 phases of suffering, and it seems like it goes way beyond just physical pain, It's almost like suffering is just kind of inherent to the human experience.
Right. It's more nuanced than just saying that suffering is inherent, though. Buddhism views it as a universal experience, but one that arises from specific causes. Primarily, our attachment to impermanent things and our aversion to those unpleasant experiences. The 8 phases kind of unpack this, moving beyond just the physical pain to really encompass a broader spectrum of the human experience.
So what are those 8 phases, and how do they kind of play out in our lives?
Well, think about those things that we all inevitably face, right? Birth, aging, sickness, death. Those are 4 of the phases. But they're not just, biological processes. They point to deeper truths about impermanence and the suffering that arises when we kind of cling to these fleeting things.
I can see that, but then there are those phases that are maybe a little less obvious, like separation from loved ones, resentment toward those we dislike, the frustration of not getting what we want, and even, the very nature of our existence as beings that are made up of the 5 aggregates: form, sensations, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. How do those kind of fit into the picture?
Well, I mean, the first 4, birth, aging, sickness, death, they're pretty self-explanatory, right? But they really represent the foundation of suffering in the Buddhist view. And everything else kind of builds upon that foundation.
Oh, I see. So it's not just about the events themselves, but what
Yeah.
they represent, right? The
Yeah.
constant change and impermanence that we try so hard to resist, and that resistance causes suffering.
Exactly. And then you have those next 4 phases, which delve into, I think, the more psychological and emotional aspects of suffering. So like separation from loved ones, that really highlights the suffering that's caused by attachment. We cling to relationships knowing that they're impermanent, yet their eventual end always brings pain.
So even positive emotions, like love, can become a source of suffering because they're inevitably tied to the potential for loss. That's a tough pill to swallow.
It is, it is. But recognizing this dynamic, I think, can also be incredibly liberating. If we understand that suffering arises from attachment, we can actually start to cultivate a more detached perspective, right?
Hmm.
Not in the sense of becoming, cold or uncaring, but in the sense of recognizing that clinging to things, even those good things, ultimately leads to pain.
I'm starting to see how this all connects. So what about those other phases like resentment and the frustration of seeking and not being able to seek? I think it says in here.
Right. Resentment really stems from our aversion to unpleasant experiences, our desire to push away, anything that causes us any sort of discomfort. But again, this is a form of attachment. It's an attachment to the idea that things should be different than they actually are.
So it's not just about clinging to pleasant things, but also clinging to the idea that those unpleasant things just shouldn't even exist.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And seeking and not being able to seek really speaks to that frustration and that suffering that arise from constantly chasing after, things that we believe are going to bring us happiness. Whether it's wealth, status, relationships, or even enlightenment itself, the very act of seeking can become a trap if we're not mindful of our motivations. And then finally, the suffering of the five aggregates points to the inherent unsatisfactoriness of clinging to our physical form, our sensations, perceptions, thoughts, and consciousness as this fixed and unchanging self.
So basically, even the components of our being are potential sources of suffering if we cling to them as permanent and unchanging.
Exactly. Because these aggregates are also impermanent. They're constantly changing. So clinging to them as this fixed self inevitably leads to suffering. Buddhist teachings really suggest that by recognizing this inherent impermanence and cultivating a more detached perspective, we can begin to free ourselves from this whole cycle of suffering.
This is all pretty mind-blowing. I'm starting to see how all these concepts, the 25 trap, these 8 phases of suffering, and this emphasis on impermanence, they're all really interconnected.
They are, and they really all point to the same core message, that true happiness and liberation don't come from clinging to those fleeting pleasures or resisting those unpleasant experiences, but from understanding the nature of reality and aligning our actions accordingly.
All right. So we've laid, I think, a pretty solid foundation for understanding these core concepts. Now let's delve maybe a bit deeper into those 4 fundamental phases of suffering: birth, aging, sickness, and death. Now, what really struck me about these texts you shared was the way they kind of break down these seemingly universal experiences into all these different categories. For instance, they mentioned like 5 types of birth. It's not just about, the physical act of entering the world, but about this beginning of life in a much, much broader sense.
You're right. The texts mention the birth of the fetus and the birth of the species, which kind of suggests this recognition of life's continuity and interconnectedness, right? It's not just about an individual's entry into the world. It's about this ongoing cycle of life itself. And they even go further, categorizing birth as birth through karma and birth by transformation, highlighting the role of our actions and the ever-changing nature of existence.
That's fascinating. It really challenges our typical view of birth as this singular event and kind of makes it part of a much, much larger process. What about aging? I noticed that they define it not just in terms of physical decline, but also in terms of mental stagnation, like clinging to outdated ideas and beliefs.
That's a really important point. The texts emphasize that true aging isn't just about, wrinkles and gray hair. It's also about the old age of thought. It's about clinging to those fixed ideas and beliefs, refusing to grow, to adapt.
So even if we manage to, stay physically fit, healthy, we can still experience a form of aging if we become mentally rigid and resistant to new ideas.
Exactly. And they categorize old age further as the old age of growth and the old age of destruction. This suggests that even as we age, there's this potential for continued growth and development, but also the possibility of decline and decay, both physically and mentally.
I love that duality. It's so true to life, isn't it? We're always kind of caught between those 2 forces. And speaking of duality, they even categorize sickness into, both physical and mental ailments, which seems pretty ahead of its time.
Definitely. They talk about the 4 great vipers, which are these imbalances in the body as a root cause of illness, which aligns with a lot of traditional medicine practices that emphasize balance and harmony, right? The 4 great vipers are wind, bile, phlegm, and blood. And when those elements are out of balance, it can lead to a lot of these various physical ailments.
That's interesting. But they don't stop there, do they? They also acknowledge the role of, mental and emotional factors, right, in both causing and exacerbating illness.
Exactly. They discuss how negative emotions like anger, greed, and delusion can really disrupt the body's balance and actually contribute to illness. And they offer, guidance on how to cultivate those more positive emotions like loving kindness, compassion, and joy, which can promote healing and well-being. And this perspective really aligns with a lot of modern understandings of the mind-body connection and how our thoughts and emotions really can impact our physical health.
It's remarkable how these ancient teachings resonate with those contemporary scientific findings. It seems they were onto something, all those centuries ago, and the examples they give are so relatable. Even today, things like, feeling stuffy and coughing, headaches, anxieties, and even foolishness, they mention. It's just a reminder that even though these texts were written centuries ago, the human experience of illness hasn't really changed all that much.
Yeah. It's a testament to the enduring wisdom of these teachings. They're not just abstract concepts. They're really grounded in this deep understanding of the human condition.
All right, let's talk about death. I have to admit, this is the one that always gives me the most pause. But the way they approach it in these texts is quite fascinating.
It is, isn't it? Instead of kind of shying away from the topic, they dive right in. They categorize death in all these various ways to really explore the nuances. So they talk about death from natural causes versus death from external causes, the death of an individual versus the death of all things, and even the different ethical implications of death based on one's actions in life.
I was particularly struck by the idea of the death of destroying the root of life. It's described as the most severe form of death, one that's associated with, this intense suffering in the hells.
Yeah, and if you connect this to that bigger picture, it highlights those karmic consequences of our actions.
Right. Certain actions, such as slandering the Mahayana equation Prajnaparamita, which refers to the Mahayana Buddhist concept of perfection of wisdom, or breaking Buddhist precepts, are seen as particularly detrimental and lead to a more difficult death and potentially even a lower rebirth. So this really underscores the importance of ethical conduct and cultivating those wholesome qualities.
It's like there's a moral dimension to death itself, not just in how we live, but also in how we die. It definitely makes you think twice about, those choices we make.
That's precisely the point. These teachings encourage us to really live mindfully, right? Understanding that our actions have consequences that extend far, far beyond this lifetime.
So it's not just about avoiding punishment in the afterlife, right? It's about living in a way that leads to a more peaceful and liberated existence, both now and in future lives. Exactly. It's about recognizing the interconnectedness of all things and understanding that our actions ripple outward, affecting not only ourselves, but also, the world around us.
That's a powerful message. And I think it segues perfectly into the next big theme that kind of emerged from these texts. The relationship between karma, behavior, and that path to enlightenment.
Right. And the study guide in particular emphasizes this connection, right? Posing those questions about how our understanding of karma can inform our actions and ultimately lead us toward the cessation of suffering. What stood out to you about this aspect?
Well, the whole concept of karma is so intriguing, right? It's not about punishment or reward from some, external force. It's really just about cause and effect. Our actions create consequences, and those consequences shape our future experiences, both in this life and beyond.
Precisely. And karma is often misunderstood, I think, as fate, but it's really about choice. We have the power to actually influence our future by making choices that align with wisdom and compassion.
So how does this tie into the 25 trap and this whole idea of moving beyond suffering?
Well, it's all connected, right? Remember that 25 trap is essentially a description of those various states of existence that we can be born into based on our karma. So by understanding this law of cause and effect, we can actually start to make choices that lead us towards more favorable rebirths and eventually to the complete cessation of suffering.
And the texts mention a path to cessation that involves powers, fearlessnesses, thoughts, and great compassion. It sounds like a pretty intense journey.
It is. And we won't delve too deeply into those specifics right now as they're explored in greater detail in other Buddhist teachings. But the key point is that there is a path, right? A way to actually break free from this cycle of suffering and attain a state of, lasting peace and liberation.
So it's not a hopeless situation. We're
Yeah.
not just doomed to suffer forever. We have agency, and we have this potential to actually create a different future for ourselves.
Exactly. That's the empowering message at the heart of these teachings.
Wow. This has been a whirlwind of information. We've covered so much ground already. From the 25 trap to these 8 phases of suffering to the intricacies of birth, old age, sickness and death and those profound implications of karma. I feel like I'm starting to grasp this interconnectedness of all of these concepts, but I'm also left with even more questions.
That's fantastic. Curiosity is the fuel for continued learning and understanding. So let's continue our exploration in the next part and see what other insights we can uncover together.
We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? We've explored these concepts of the 25 trap, the 8 phases of suffering, the whole idea of karma and how our actions are really interconnected with everything else. And now I'm curious about how all of this applies to our own lives. What does it actually mean to kind of embrace these Buddhist teachings on a personal level?
That's the real question, isn't it? The million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And the answer is going to be different, of course, for everyone. But maybe a good place to start is with this idea from the text. It says that all beings in the world have a subverted mind, craving for birth and detesting old age and death.
Yeah.
Does that resonate with you at all?
It definitely does. I mean, think about it. We spend so much time, so much energy, trying to defy aging, clinging to youth, fearing death. It's almost like we're fighting against the natural flow of life itself.
Yeah. That's a great way to put it. We resist change. We fear, the unknown. But what if instead of resisting, we kind of embrace this impermanence as a fundamental truth of existence?
I can see how that kind of shift in perspective could be incredibly liberating, but it's easier said than done, right? To actually let go of that need to control everything, to accept that change is inevitable.
Well, absolutely. It takes practice. It takes, a willingness to challenge those deeply ingrained habits. But the texts do offer, some guidance on how to do that. They talk about cultivating certain qualities. They mention powers, fearlessnesses, thoughts, and then great compassion, things that help us navigate the challenges of life with, I think, greater wisdom and resilience.
Okay. What exactly are those powers and fearlessnesses? They sound kind of like superpowers.
Well, not quite superpowers, I'd say, but they're
Yes.
definitely qualities that can empower us to be sure. The powers refer to things like mindfulness, concentration, wisdom, things that help us develop a clear and focused mind so we can see things as they are without those distortions of our, desires and fears.
So it's about kind of developing mental strength and clarity.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And the fearlessnesses are really about overcoming the fear of death, the fear of suffering, the fear of the unknown.
Right.
And this doesn't mean, of course, that we become reckless, right? It's about facing those challenges with courage and understanding that they are really just inherent parts of the human experience.
Okay. I'm starting to see how these qualities could be incredibly helpful. Not just in dealing with those, big kind of existential questions, but also in navigating the everyday ups and downs of life.
Exactly. Yeah. If we can cultivate these qualities, we're much better equipped to handle stress, to make, wise decisions, and to respond to challenges with greater skill.
And what about thoughts? What role did they play in this path to liberation?
Well, the texts talk about cultivating what they call right thoughts, which are really rooted in wisdom, compassion, and understanding. It's about being mindful of the stories that we tell ourselves, the judgments that we make, the assumptions that we hold.
So it's about kind of training our minds to see things from multiple perspectives and respond with kindness rather than just, reacting.
Yeah. And it's an ongoing process, of course. It takes effort. But our thoughts really do shape our realities. So shifting those patterns can be really transformative.
And then there's great compassion. That one seems pretty self-explanatory, but I'd love to hear, your take on it.
Yeah. Compassion is often seen as just feeling sorry for others, but it's much, much deeper than that. It's about really understanding their suffering, connecting with their humanity, and offering kindness and support. It's about recognizing, I think, our interconnectedness and realizing that their well-being is really intertwined with our own.
So it's not just about being a nice person. It's about understanding that fundamental unity of all beings and acting accordingly.
Exactly. And when we cultivate compassion, we not only benefit others, but we also, cultivate peace and happiness within ourselves.
Yeah, it all seems to come full circle, doesn't it? We started with this idea of being kind of trapped in this cycle of existence, but we're discovering that we actually have this power to influence our own our own journey.
Yeah. That's the beauty of these teachings, I think. They don't shy away from the reality of suffering, but they offer this path toward, healing and transformation. It's an invitation to kind of wake up, to see things as they are, and to really live in alignment with our deepest values.
It's not a passive path, though, is it? It requires, effort, mindfulness, and a willingness to challenge our own assumptions and habits.
You're right. It's about embracing the journey with all its ups and downs, and finding those moments of peace and joy amidst those inevitable challenges of life.
Going back to those 8 phases of suffering, we discussed how even those positive experiences, like love, can be sources of suffering, because of their impermanent nature. Could we apply that same principle to those negative experiences?
That's an insightful question. What do you mean?
Well, if we acknowledge that joy and love are impermanent, couldn't that make it a little bit easier to let go of the suffering that comes with loss and separation?
Yeah.
And if we can acknowledge that pain and grief are also impermanent, wouldn't that make those experiences a little more bearable?
That's a really profound observation. Yeah. Recognizing the impermanent nature of all experiences, both the positive and the negative ones, might actually lessen our attachment to
So it's almost like finding a way to transcend that duality of pleasure and pain by just accepting the impermanence of everything.
Yeah. It's like finding this still point at the center of the wheel,
Mhm.
a place of equanimity where we can kind of observe that ever-changing nature of experience without getting swept away by the tides of emotion.
That's such a powerful image, and it ties in so beautifully with this whole idea of cultivating mindfulness. I mean, we can notice the impermanent nature of our experiences, more directly by developing this mindful awareness of our thoughts, our feelings, and our sensations.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
and that awareness can be incredibly liberating,
Yeah.
because it allows us to choose how we respond to those experiences
Mm.
rather than just reacting out of habit. It gives us the power to step back, to observe, and to make choices that are aligned with wisdom and compassion.
This has been a really enlightening conversation. We've taken a deep dive into this Buddhist thought and emerged with a renewed sense of possibility.
I agree, and I think we've only scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore and contemplate.
That's the beauty of these deep dives, I think. They spark curiosity and encourage, continued exploration. What key takeaways do you think our listeners should kind of consider as they, continue this exploration?
That's a great question. I I think one of the most important takeaways is that suffering is a universal human experience.
Hmm.
It's not something to be ashamed of or to try to avoid at all costs. In fact, Buddhism actually suggests that acknowledging and understanding suffering is the first step towards freeing ourselves from it.
That's a powerful statement. But how do we actually apply that, practically? Acknowledging suffering is one thing, but facing it head on, that's another thing entirely.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not easy, but remember those 8 phases of suffering we talked about. That's one of the tools that these teachings provide. They help us recognize the different forms that suffering takes in our lives. It's not always obvious, like physical pain. Sometimes it's more subtle, like clinging to a relationship or constantly craving something we don't have.
So by understanding those phases, we can see more clearly how suffering is kind of showing up in our lives and then begin to address it.
Exactly. And a big part of that is recognizing the role of impermanence.
Yeah.
Everything changes, including our experiences of suffering. If we can remember that, we can start to let go of the idea that suffering is permanent or that it defines who we are.
It's like that saying, "This too shall pass." But honestly, sometimes it's hard to believe that when you're in the middle of something really, really tough.
Yeah. It's not about, pretending that suffering doesn't exist or that it doesn't matter. It's about shifting our perspective to see it as part of a larger process of growth, of transformation. And that's really where this concept of karma comes in.
Right, because understanding that our actions have consequences, that can help us make choices that lead to greater happiness and well-being both now and in those future lives.
Exactly. Karma is often, I think, mistaken for fate, but but it's really about choice. We shape our destiny
Yeah.
through our actions every single day.
So does that mean that we should be like constantly trying to avoid that negative karma?
It's less about, avoiding negative karma and more about understanding that even our mistakes, right? Our mistakes can be opportunities for learning, for growth. The key is to learn from those missteps and make amends when possible.
That's a helpful way to look at it. It takes the pressure off of needing to be, perfect all the time.
Yeah.
And I feel like this ties in, nicely with this idea of cultivating compassion, both for ourselves and for others.
Absolutely. Compassion is essential really for navigating those life challenges and finding genuine happiness.
Yeah.
When we treat ourselves and others with kindness and understanding, it really creates this ripple effect of positive change.
And this all kind of circles back to that interconnectedness that these teachings emphasize. Our well-being is deeply intertwined with the well-being of all beings. It's not just about seeking personal happiness in isolation.
You've hit on a key point. These Buddhist teachings aren't just about personal enlightenment. They offer this framework for creating a more just and compassionate world.
So by cultivating, wisdom, compassion, and mindfulness, we can actually contribute to a more peaceful and sustainable future.
Yeah. Exactly, and that brings us to the heart of what we've been exploring today. These teachings aren't just abstract concepts. They offer this practical guidance, I think, for living a more meaningful and fulfilling life, both for ourselves and for the world around us.
This has been such a rich and insightful conversation. I feel like we've only just begun to explore the depths of these teachings. What would you say to our listener who's kind of been on this journey with us today? What should they take away from this deep dive?
I would encourage them to continue exploring these ideas.
Right.
There are many resources available, books, online courses, even meditation groups, to help deepen their understanding.
That's a great point. There's a whole world of resources waiting for anyone who wants to learn more. And as always, we encourage you, our listener, to reach out to us with any questions or reflections you might have. We love hearing from you and learning from your insights.
Absolutely. We're all on this journey together.
This brings us to the end of our deep dive into these really profound Buddhist concepts. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you found this exploration enlightening and perhaps even inspiring.
And until next time, may you find peace and well-being in the present moment.